Okay. I want to tell you about America. Not the America you think you know. Not the America of the history textbook you fell asleep in during fourth period. Not the America of the PowerPoint with the clip art eagle and the bullet points about the founding fathers. I know you know that America. Everybody knows that America. I want to tell you about the real one. The one that starts 20,000 years ago with a group of people following a mammoth across a frozen plain with absolutely no idea what they were getting themselves into. The one that involves a city bigger than London that most Americans have never heard of. The one where a man sails 3,000 miles in the wrong direction, hits the wrong continent, insists he found Asia, and somehow still has a federal holiday named after him. This is the story of America. The whole thing. And I promise you, it is stranger, funnier, more heartbreaking, and more extraordinary than the version you were taught. It is a story about people in denial. Columbus was in denial about what he found. The Virginia Company was in denial about what it takes to survive in a wilderness. The Founding Fathers were in denial about the massive contradiction sitting right in the middle of their beautiful Declaration. Andrew Jackson was in denial about what the words Supreme Court ruling mean. And America itself has always been in denial about the gap between what it says it is and what it actually does. Which, when you think about it, is also the most American thing about it. Get comfortable. The story starts 20,000 years ago on a frozen plain in what is now Alaska, and it is going to take a while. Let's go. Quick geography lesson. 20,000 years ago, you could walk from Russia to Alaska. Not because either country was particularly well organized at the time, but because the ocean between them was frozen solid and the sea level was low enough to expose a strip of land hundreds of miles wide. Scientists call this Oringia. The people crossing it called it Tuesday. They were not explorers. They were not adventurers. They were hunter-gatherers following large animals into territory that looked promising. The large animals in question were mammoths. And I want to take a moment to appreciate the mammoth, because the mammoth is one of the greatest animals that ever lived, and we do not give it nearly enough credit. It was the size of a school bus. It had tusks the length of a small car. It had hair. And it was, according to the fossil record, genuinely difficult to kill. These were not gentle giants. These were enormous, shaggy, cold-adapted tanks with tusks and a general attitude. And these people followed them, on foot, into an unknown continent because they were hungry. What happened next is one of the great stories of human history. Over the next 10 to 15,000 years, these people spread across two entire continents. They reached the tip of South America. They settled the Amazon rainforest. They built civilizations in the Andes and in the jungles of Mexico and on the plains of North America and in the deserts of the Southwest and in the forests of the Northeast. And by 1491, the year before Columbus arrived, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. 50 to 100 million, living in hundreds of distinct cultures, speaking hundreds of distinct languages, building cities, writing poetry, doing astronomy, running governments. You know, the usual things people do when they've been living somewhere for 20,000 years. Now here's the part that genuinely blows my mind every time I think about it. The city of Cahokia. Cahokia was located near what is now St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around 1100 AD, it had a population of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. London, at the same moment in history, had about 15,000. So Cahokia was roughly the same size as London, in the middle of what Europeans would later describe as untouched wilderness. untouched. There was a city there, with neighborhoods and plazas and a massive public monument that, and I cannot stress this enough, has a larger base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Monk's Mound, 14 acres at the base. The Great Pyramid of Giza, 13 acres at the base. Built by hand, one basket of dirt at a time, over 300 years, by people who had no metal tools, no wheel, no draft animals, just an enormous amount of determination and a really good reason to move dirt. And then, around 1350 AD, Cahokia was abandoned. Nobody knows why. Climate change, probably. Political collapse, maybe. Disease, possibly. It was just there. And then it wasn't. Like so many things in this story, out in the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were building cliff cities in the sides of canyons. Multi-story apartment complexes with hundreds of rooms, aligned to the solstice, connected by roads stretching hundreds of miles across the desert. Chaco Canyon, an urban complex of 9 square miles, built by people with no wheel. In the southeast, the Mississippian cultures were building ceremonial centers along the river systems, trading copper from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, creating a continent-wide network of exchange that most history books give about half a sentence. On the Great Plains, the relationship between indigenous peoples and the American bison was developing into something extraordinary. The bison herds at their peak numbered 60 million animals. 60 million. Running in herds large enough to take 3 days to pass a single point. Dark enough from a distance to look like the ground was moving. And the cultures of the plains built their entire civilization around these animals. Not just food, housing, clothing, tools, fuel, spiritual life, everything. The bison was not just a resource, it was the center of the world. And then there was the Great Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast. 5 nations, later 6, united under a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. A democratic system with checks and balances, mechanisms for resolving disputes, and rights protections that historians have argued directly influenced the Founding Fathers when they were designing their own government. The Iroquois Confederacy had been governing itself this way for perhaps 200 years before 1776. Some of the founders knew about it. Some of them had met with Iroquois leaders. Some of them were taking notes. Which makes the phrase, "we invented democracy," slightly more complicated than it usually gets presented. So, the Americas in 1491. Millions of people, hundreds of cultures, thriving cities, sophisticated governments, continental trade networks, astronomical knowledge, art, music, literature, medicine, an entire world. A fully formed, breathing, living world. And then a boat appeared on the horizon. Let me tell you about Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was a man who was wrong about almost everything he believed and accidentally changed the entire world because of it. He was born in Genoa, Italy, around 1451. He was stubborn, brilliant, deeply religious, obsessively ambitious, and possessed of a level of confidence in his own calculations that every other navigator in Europe found somewhere between inspiring and clinically concerning. His big idea was this: the world is round. Asia is very valuable. If you sail west from Europe, you'll eventually reach Asia from the other direction. This reasoning was correct. His math, however, was spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Columbus thought the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. He thought Asia was roughly where the Caribbean sits. Every educated navigator in Europe who looked at his numbers knew this was wrong. Portugal turned him down. Spain almost turned him down. He spent years trying to find someone, anyone willing to fund what his contemporaries largely regarded as a suicide mission. Queen Isabella of Spain eventually said yes. Not because she thought he was right, but because she figured if it somehow worked, Spain would control the Asian spice trade, and that was worth gambling on. Columbus set sail in August 1492 with 3 ships and about 90 men. The crossing took 36 days, by which point his crew was deeply unhappy, deeply skeptical, and making pointed remarks about mutiny. On the night of October 11th, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana spotted land from the crow's nest of the Pinta. He shouted. He fired the signal cannon. He had found it. Columbus later claimed that he himself had spotted a light the previous evening, and therefore deserved the 10,000 maravedis reward that had been promised to the first person to sight land. He took the money. Rodrigo de Triana got nothing. Columbus was that kind of person. The following morning, Columbus came ashore on an island in the Bahamas. The Taino people who lived there came down to the beach to see what was happening. They brought gifts, food, parrots, cotton thread. They were friendly and curious and generous. Columbus wrote about them in his journal. He noted they were well built, handsome, gentle. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't know what a sword was. One of his men demonstrated by letting a Taino man touch the blade, and the man cut his hand and seemed confused. And then Columbus wrote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." Day 1. He wrote this on day 1. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas. He never found Asia. He never found the gold he promised Spain. He governed the Caribbean colonies so badly, including enslaving indigenous people on a massive scale, that he was eventually arrested by a Spanish investigator and sent back to Spain in chains. In chains. Sent home in chains by the country he had worked for. Not exactly how the Columbus Day Parade usually tells it. On the Great Plains, the relationship between indigenous peoples and the American bison was developing into something extraordinary. The bison herds at their peak numbered 60 million animals. 60 million. Running in herds large enough to take 3 days to pass a single point. Dark enough from a distance to look like the ground was moving. And the cultures of the plains built their entire civilization around these animals. Not just food, housing, clothing, tools, fuel, spiritual life, everything. The bison was not just a resource, it was the center of the world. And then there was the great Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast. 5 nations, later 6, united under a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. A democratic system with checks and balances, mechanisms for resolving disputes, and rights protections that historians have argued directly influenced the Founding Fathers when they were designing their own government. The Iroquois Confederacy had been governing itself this way for perhaps 200 years before 1776. Some of the founders knew about it. Some of them had met with Iroquois leaders. Some of them were taking notes. Which makes the phrase, "we invented democracy," slightly more complicated than it usually gets presented. So, the Americas in 1491. Millions of people, hundreds of cultures, thriving cities, sophisticated governments, continental trade networks, astronomical knowledge, art, music, literature, medicine. An entire world. A fully formed, breathing, living world. And then a boat appeared on the horizon. While Columbus was still arguing about whether he'd found Asia, other Spaniards were moving in. Fast. The Spanish had gold fever so severe it basically functions as a personality disorder in the historical record. In 1519, a Spanish soldier named Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico with 500 men, 16 horses, and a level of audacity that was extraordinary even by conquistador standards. He was not supposed to be there. His expedition had been canceled before he left. He went anyway. He burned his own ships on the beach so his men couldn't retreat. Just burned them. We are not going back. We are either conquering this or we are dying here. Which is either the greatest military psychology move in history or the most insane thing anyone has ever done on a Tuesday morning. Probably both. Cortés marched inland and found the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan, its capital, was an island city in a lake in what is now Mexico City. Population? Approximately 200,000 people. Connected to the shore by enormous causeways, fed by aqueducts. Home to a market that Spanish observers described as bigger and better organized than anything in Spain. Cortés walked into this city with 500 men and survived. Partly because of steel weapons and horses and guns. Partly because the Aztec Empire was not beloved. It had been extracting brutal tribute from neighboring peoples for generations, and those peoples were very interested in helping Cortés destroy it. And partly because smallpox arrived in the city before the Spanish army did, killing tens of thousands of people, including the emperor who was leading the resistance. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 75 days, and when it was over, the city was rubble. Cortés built Mexico City on the ruins, using the stones of the temples as foundation material, which is a statement. Francisco Pizarro did something similar in Peru. He conquered the Inca Empire, 12 million people, with 168 men. The story involves luring the Inca emperor to a meeting, capturing him, accepting an enormous ransom of gold and silver, enough to fill a room 20 feet long, and then killing the emperor anyway, because Pizarro decided the deal no longer worked for him. The Inca never really recovered from this, which was, presumably, the point. Francisco Pizarro was not a complicated man. By the end of the 1500s, Spain controlled an empire stretching from the southwestern United States to the tip of South America. The largest empire in the world, built in less than a century, on a foundation of epidemic disease, military conquest, and forced labor. And silver. The silver mines of Mexico and Peru pumped so much silver into the global economy that they literally caused inflation in Europe. Too much money, too few goods. The Spanish Empire was the first truly global economy, powered, as most things in this story are, by the suffering of people who had no say in any of it. England watched all of this with enormous jealousy. The particular jealousy of a country that considers itself the most important country in the world and is watching Spain get embarrassingly rich while England sits at home. Their first real attempt at a North American colony was Roanoke, 1585, the Outer Banks of what is now North Carolina. 117 people dropped off with supplies. The supply ship had to go back to England. And then England went to war with Spain, which was more urgent than the colony. So the supply ship didn't come back for 3 years. When it finally arrived in 1590, everyone was gone. No bodies, no signs of violence, no explanation of any kind. Just the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post, and the name of a nearby island on a tree. The lost colony of Roanoke. The most likely explanation, historians now believe, is that the colonists eventually integrated with the local Croatoan people and became someone else entirely. They survived by becoming part of the world they had arrived in, which is quietly poetic. England filed this under lessons learned and tried again. Jamestown, 1607. Virginia. 104 men. A private investment company called the Virginia Company. And the single worst personnel decision in American colonial history. They sent gentlemen. Not farmers, not craftspeople, not builders or hunters or people with practical skills. Gentlemen. Men whose social status specifically depended on not working with their hands. To a wilderness. In August. Which then became winter. Without enough food, without adequate tools, without a plan beyond find gold and send it back. There was no gold. Of the 104 men who arrived in May 1607, 66 were dead by September. Disease, contaminated water, starvation, and, historians gently note, a significant number of men who genuinely refused to do physical labor because they considered it beneath their station, while starving. There is a specific kind of denial here that is almost beautiful in its stubbornness. I am a gentleman. Gentlemen do not dig latrines. I will therefore not dig latrines. They dug no latrines. The colony was saved by Captain John Smith, who was not a gentleman, who was a 5'4" soldier of fortune from Lincolnshire, who had been enslaved by the Ottoman Empire and escaped across Russia on horseback. He was 27 years old when he arrived at Jamestown. He had an enormous beard, and he had a rule. He that will not work shall not eat. This was considered controversial among men who were starving because they would not work. I cannot stress enough how much these men needed someone exactly like John Smith. The Powhatan Confederacy, the alliance of Algonquian peoples who had been living in this region for centuries, were the actual reason Jamestown survived. They provided food during the worst periods. They traded. They shared agricultural knowledge. The relationship was complex and increasingly strained, but in those early years, without Powhatan generosity, there would have been no Jamestown. Pocahontas. We have to talk about Pocahontas. The real one, not the Disney one. The real story is both more interesting and considerably more sad. Her real name was Amonute. Pocahontas was a nickname. It meant something like playful one, or possibly ill-behaved child, which I find delightful. She was the daughter of the paramount chief Wahun Seneca, and she was approximately 10 years old when John Smith arrived. The famous scene where she throws herself across John Smith's body to save his life was described by John Smith, decades after it supposedly happened, in a memoir about himself. Historians are not convinced. What actually happened to her is not a love story. In 1613, English colonists kidnapped her as a diplomatic hostage, leverage to use in negotiations with her father. While held captive, she was converted to Christianity and renamed Rebecca. She married a tobacco farmer named John Rolfe. She was taken to England in 1616 as a curiosity, presented at court, briefly famous. She died in 1617, on the Thames River, age approximately 21, preparing to sail home. She never made it. That is the real story of Pocahontas, a young woman who had her entire world taken from her and died trying to get back to it. The colony found its economic salvation not in gold, but in tobacco. John Rolfe, yes, the man who married Pocahontas, developed a strain of Virginia tobacco smooth enough for European tastes. And Virginia, as it turned out, was perfect for growing it. By the 1620s, tobacco was the foundation of the colonial economy, and the tobacco economy needed labor, more labor than England could provide. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, described in the records as 20 and odd Negroes. Their names were not recorded. Their origins were not recorded. They were the beginning of something vast and terrible that would shape American history for the next 2.5 centuries, and whose consequences reach all the way into the present. In November 1620, a group of English separatists arrived further north, the Pilgrims, on a ship called the Mayflower, after 66 days at sea, which by all accounts were miserable. They landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, in November. If you've ever been to Massachusetts in November, it's cold, gray. The wind comes off the ocean with the kind of personal hostility that suggests it read your browser history. It is not the ideal time to start a new civilization. Of the 102 people who landed, 45 were dead by spring. They were saved by a man named Squanto. And I need you to understand that Squanto's story is one of the most extraordinary and most heartbreaking stories in all of American history. He was Patuxent, a member of a Massachusetts coastal people. In 1614, he was kidnapped by an English sea captain named Thomas Hunt, who wanted to sell him as a slave in Spain. Squanto was taken to Malaga, sold. He escaped, made his way to England, learned English, found passage on a ship heading back to North America. He arrived home in 1619, after 5 years away, and found his entire village gone. An epidemic had passed through while he was away. Every single person of his people was dead. His mother, his father, everyone he had ever known. He was the last Patuxent, standing on the land where his whole world had been, surrounded by nothing but absence. When the Pilgrims arrived the following year, half dead and desperate, Squanto introduced himself and taught them how to plant corn, how to fish these particular waters, how to survive in a world that was trying to kill them. He did not do this because he owed the English anything. He owed them nothing, not one thing. He did it anyway. Out of pragmatism, partly, the English alliance gave him resources and protection, but also, perhaps, out of something simpler, the desire to help people who are clearly suffering, even people who looked exactly like the ones who had taken everything from him. In the autumn of 1621, the Pilgrims held a harvest celebration. About 90 Wampanoag people attended, to 22 surviving Pilgrims. They ate together for 3 days. We call it Thanksgiving. The Wampanoag have a different name for what followed, but for 3 days, in the autumn of 1621, they ate together. Over the next 150 years, Britain built 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. Each one different, each one weird in its own specific way. Massachusetts, Puritans, extremely religious, extremely certain they were right about everything, extremely interested in what their neighbors were doing and whether it met their standards. Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams, who was kicked out of Massachusetts for suggesting people should be allowed to believe different things. Rhode Island became one of the only places in the 17th century world where you could actually practice religious freedom. Massachusetts was furious. Some things don't change. New York, originally New Amsterdam, Dutch colony. The English took it in 1664 when the Dutch decided defending it wasn't worth the trouble, and essentially handed it over. The Dutch later traded it to England in exchange for Suriname, which they considered the better deal. History has had mixed feelings about this assessment ever since. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, a Quaker, as a genuine experiment in tolerance and peace. Penn paid the Lenape people for the land he settled on, which was so unusual in the context of 17th century colonialism that it genuinely stands out every time it's mentioned. Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, the southern colonies. Warm, agricultural, increasingly, catastrophically, morally dependent on enslaved labor. By 1750, there were roughly 240,000 enslaved African people in the American colonies. By 1790, after independence, that number had reached 700,000. These were people with names and families and languages and skills and inner lives of full, complete complexity, who had been taken from their homes by force, who were legally defined as property, who built the tobacco fields and rice plantations and the cities and the roads and the houses of the people who owned them, who resisted constantly in every way available to them, through the preservation of language and culture and music, through slowdowns and sabotage, through hundreds of acts of escape, through dozens of open rebellions that history mostly did not record. The story of America cannot be told honestly without them at its center. Something interesting was happening to the English colonists during these 150 years. They were becoming something else. A man born in Virginia in 1700 had never seen England. His accent was different. His food was different. His entire relationship to the land was different. He wasn't English. He was something new. He was American. He just didn't have a word for it yet. And when Britain decided in the 1760s that it was time to start treating these colonies more like colonies, the colonies had been governing themselves for 100 years. They did not receive this development well. Not even slightly. The American Revolution did not begin with idealism. It began with a tax on tea. Well, not exactly. It began with a series of taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, that Parliament passed without giving the American colonies any representation in the body passing them. No taxation without representation. A slogan that is 6 words long and still, 250 years later, exactly captures the problem. The British repealed the Stamp Act, and then immediately passed another one, then another. They could not stop passing taxes. In December 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians, because subtlety was not the mood, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of British tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party. Roughly 90,000 pounds of tea destroyed in one night. To make a point about taxes. Americans have always had a flair for the dramatic. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, closed Boston Harbor, put Massachusetts under military rule, required colonists to house British soldiers. The colonists immediately renamed them the Intolerable Acts, which tells you exactly where things stood. April 19, 1775. British soldiers marching toward conquered Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons. Paul Revere riding through the night. Militiamen gathering on the Lexington Green. Nobody knows who fired first. It doesn't matter who fired first. Somebody did. And 8 years of war had begun. The Continental Army. I want to be honest with you about the Continental Army. The Army was, at various points, barefoot, starving, unpaid for months, suffering from smallpox, typhus, and dysentery at the same time. deserting at rates that would have caused a modern military commander to require therapy. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, winter of 1777 to 1778. 2,000 soldiers died there, not in battle, of cold and disease and starvation. Men left bloody footprints in the snow because they had no shoes. And through all of this, George Washington held them together. Not through genius, he lost more battles than he won. Through presence, through the simple, extraordinary act of refusing to quit, of being there every morning, still there. When the war ended and some of his officers suggested Washington might become king, he said no, went home to his farm, then came back and served 2 terms as president, then went home again. Twice given ultimate power, twice walked away from it voluntarily. In the entire history of people who win independence through military force, almost none of them do that. Washington did it twice. That is not a small thing. July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Written by a man who owned approximately 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. This contradiction was visible at the time. Samuel Johnson asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" The founders did not answer this question. They decided to leave it for later. Later turned out to be 1861, and it cost 600,000 lives. The revolution was won in 1781 at Yorktown, with enormous help from France. The French were so delighted to be humiliating Britain that they provided troops, money, and the naval blockade that made victory possible. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, American independence recognized, and a new country, improbable, brilliant, contradictory, enormous, started the complicated work of figuring out what it actually was. The first attempt at a national government was called the Articles of Confederation. It was so weak that the federal government couldn't collect taxes, couldn't enforce its own laws, couldn't stop states from doing whatever they wanted. It was essentially a strongly worded suggestion, which is not, as it turns out, how you run a country. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 produced something better, the Constitution. Not perfect, it contained compromises that would later nearly destroy the country, but a genuine, serious attempt to build a government that could correct its own mistakes. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, added in 1791. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial. The framework of a country that was trying, however imperfectly, to mean what it said. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Napoleon needed money for his European wars. He sold Thomas Jefferson the entire Louisiana Territory, 828,000 square miles, for $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. Jefferson wasn't entirely sure he had the constitutional authority to do this. He did it anyway. The Lewis and Clark expedition set out the following year. 2 years, 8,000 miles, from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean and back. They survived largely because of Sacagawea, a 16-year-old Shoshone woman who served as interpreter, guide, and diplomatic bridge to every indigenous nation they encountered, while carrying a newborn baby. Her contribution was essential. Her name appeared in very few of the official documents. That pattern again. As America expanded westward, the people who had been living there for 20,000 years found themselves in the path of something unstoppable. The Indian Removal Act, 1830. Andrew Jackson. Forced removal of the 5 civilized tribes from their homelands in the southeast. The Cherokee took the United States government to the Supreme Court and won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in their favor. Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling, ignored the Supreme Court of the United States, as if it had not happened. The Trail of Tears, 1838 to 1839. 16,000 Cherokee people forced to walk 1,000 miles west in winter. Approximately 4,000 of them died, of cold, of disease, of starvation, of being forced to walk 1,000 miles in winter by a government that had just promised them their rights. The West was won, as the saying goes. The saying never mentions the price. The California Gold Rush, 1849. 100,000 people flooded into California in a single year. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connecting the continent, built largely by Chinese laborers under conditions that were brutal even by the standards of the time. The bison herds. 60 million animals at the start of the century. Fewer than 1,000 by 1889. Shot for sport, shot for hides, shot deliberately as policy to destroy the food supply and way of life of the Plains nations. The question the founders had set aside had been growing for 70 years. By 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in the United States. 4 million human beings, legally defined as property. In a country whose founding document said, all men are created equal. The Civil War did not begin with a bang. It began with an election. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November 1860. He was not an abolitionist. He said so repeatedly. He had no intention of touching slavery where it already existed. He simply wanted to stop it from expanding into new territories. To the South, that was enough. South Carolina seceded in December. 6 more states followed before Lincoln was even inaugurated. The Confederate States of America, founded, in the words of its own Vice President Alexander Stephens, on what he called the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. He said this in a speech in March 1861, publicly, while it was happening. That is not history's characterization. Those are his words. The war lasted 4 years, 1861 to 1865, and it killed somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers. More Americans than died in both world wars combined. The Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. Lincoln declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. It had limited immediate practical effect, but it changed the meaning of the war entirely. It made the Union cause explicitly about ending slavery. It blocked Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, and it opened the Union Army to black soldiers. 200,000 black men served in the Union Army, many of them formerly enslaved, fighting for their own freedom, with a motivation that no white soldier could fully share. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, April 9, 1865. The war was over. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington. He died the following morning, never seeing the peace he had spent everything to reach. The Reconstruction that followed, the amendments that abolished slavery and granted citizenship and voting rights, The brief, extraordinary period when black men served in Congress was followed by 100 years of deliberate, organized, violent dismantling of everything that had been gained. Jim Crow, sharecropping, the Klan, lynching. 100 years of legal, organized, systematic oppression. The Civil War ended slavery. What came after required another century to even begin to address, and whose consequences are still present.
That is part 1. 20,000 years of history. From a frozen plain in Alaska to the rubble of a country that tore itself in half over a question it should have answered at the beginning. It is not a simple story. It never was. But I want you to hold something with you as you drift towards sleep tonight. Through all of it, through every mistake, every act of cruelty, every catastrophic decision made by people who should have known better, there were also ordinary people, just trying to live. The woman who carried her children's names in her memory when everything else was taken from her. The farmer who followed an animal across a frozen plain and accidentally discovered a continent. Squanto, standing alone on the land where his world had been, helping strangers anyway. The soldier at Valley Forge, still there in the morning. The Cherokee mother, walking. They are all in this story, every one of them. Rest now. Part 2 is waiting when you're ready. But tonight the story settles around you like something old and patient, like the land itself, which has been here for all of it, which was here before any of us, and will be here long after. Sleep well.